America was finally free from England after the Congress of Vienna that had seen a meeting of Austria, Prussia, Russia, France, and England. And all these wanted to get back to the good old days before Napoleon, to put the nobility back in charge and forget all about revolutionary France. And Austria was given back her territories of Salzburg and Trieste, and Russia was given most of Poland. The participants in the Congress of Vienna had already been meeting at Chaumont in France since the spring of 1813, and after the Battle of the Nations they moved their conference to Vienna, which was just as pleasant a location, if not more, and the Napoleonic Wars to stop the French from rolling over Europe all the way to Moscow had cost the British 9 times what they'd spent to fight the Americans 32 years earlier. The good that came out of the Napoleonic Wars was that America had been left alone long enough to begin to get its house in order, and what trouble the British managed to stir up in North America while Britain was busy chasing Napoleon served to firmly unite the American states in common cause for national security. While Napoleon had been getting ready on the 24th of June in 1812 to march into Russia for the Battle of Borodino on the 7th of September, the British landed troops in Turkey in May of 1812 by telling the Turks that the Russians were on the way, and that set up the Crimean War in 1853 when Russia was told that Britain was taking over Turkey again, and the Tsar sent troops to stop them, especially because the British had landed in Turkey to fight the French. Russia wanted Serbia in order to have some access to the Mediterranean in case Britain shut off the Strait of Constantinople. And the British Crown needed to rein in the British East India Company, who'd become more powerful than the Crown's own army, thanks to the lucrative opium trade. And the British Army had finally grown strong enough in 1853 to override the private BEIC militias because Napoleon was no longer a threat. The Crimean War would allow the British Crown to become the sovereign of India after ending the British East India Company's reign, after which the increased cost of sending soldiers to India would force the Crown to raise the price of opium, and that meant cutting down the oversupply, which meant Turkey, who was the second largest grower after India, and the fact remained that Turkey had a better product. In the decade before the Crimean War, railroad building had boomed into a mania, and by the time Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm II went to French Morocco with a warship in 1911 to help the French keep the British out of the port of Agadir in French North Africa, the new railroad trains allowed the rich children of the nobility to amuse themselves by gambling aboard the trains, going easily from Italy to France to Germany and all the way to Russia, from one card game to another in comfort and in style. The trains had special cars specifically for the gamblers that were full of velvet and mirrors and silver and fine furniture, and Franz Ferdinand had been getting his gambling money from his wife's Russian friends who were trying to curry favor with the future Emperor of Austria over Serbia, where many Russians lived, and Franz Ferdinand's Austrian father would turn his gambling debts into an international incident. The Austrians were blaming the Tsar's family for loaning money to Franz Ferdinand so he could lose it over gaming tables. And while there was no way to know who was loaning him that money, he certainly wasn't getting it from his strict Austrian family with their behind-closed-doors claim to the throne of the Holy Roman Empire. And when Franz Ferdinand was assassinated on the 28th of June in 1914, Austria tried to blame the Russians for conscripting the Serbians to kill the heir to the Austrian throne, but it could have been anyone to whom he owed money. And History Anonymous isn't telling. A French intermediary may offer some clues because a Frenchman was supposed to be carrying messages between the Austrian emperor and the Russian Tsar, but the message had gotten garbled and arrived a day too late, after the orders to mobilize for war had already been sent out. The German Secretary of State von Jagow did not believe that Russia would declare war because it was just a small dispute between Vienna and St. Petersburg. But someone had to take the blame for the murdering of Franz Ferdinand over his gambling debts, and Serbia was a ready scapegoat. Von Jagow said during the July crisis that if Austria wanted Germany to join with them in a war against Russia, he would not, quote, jib at the post, close quote, which was a horse racing term used when a horse balks before leaving the gate, and the president of France had been at the Longchamps racetrack when he'd received the news of the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. Mr. Viviani had just been appointed the Prime Minister of France on the 13th of June and was now in charge of the military budget of $360 million, and the French President and Viviani left for St. Petersburg on the 15th of July and arrived on the 20th of July, and they agreed with the Tsar that they would support his opposing Austria trying to take over Serbia in the wake of Franz Ferdinand's assassination, and von Jagow had thought the Tsar was bluffing about actually going to war to defend Serbia. Viviani and the French president left Russia 3 days later on the 23rd of July, and they would arrive back in Paris on the 30th, and that day Viviani sent a telegram to the Tsar that Russia should not mobilize or do anything to provoke Germany, and the following day France mobilized and Germany threatened to march into France if they didn't immediately end their support for Russia. The Austrians sent a cablegram to Serbia on the 23rd of July that was called a Demarche, and the message had been transmitted just as soon as the French sailed away from St. Petersburg, and the Austrians gave Serbia 24 hours to respond to a long list of demands that would completely squash any Russian friendship with Serbia, including letting Austrian police enforce the law in Serbia. The Tsar told the Serbians to go ahead and cooperate with the Austrians, and the Serbians sent a cable back agreeing to Austria's outrageous demands. And when the Austrians continued to agitate for war, the British intervened with an offer of mediation between Russia, Austria, France, and Germany. But von Jagow sabotaged the offer from Britain by waiting for another 48 hours to deliver the British offer of negotiation. Another version was that the French president and Viviani were out at sea aboard the battleship France on their way back from seeing the Tsar, and the Germans jammed the radio message between Paris and the brand new French dreadnought France that had the president and Viviani aboard. Although it was possible that the ship's signal communications equipment had not yet been installed because the battleship was still in its fitting out stage, which would not be completed until August, and Viviani and the French president had been irrepressibly eager to take their new warship on a cruise through the Baltic to visit the Tsar. Germany was also eager to try out all their new Krupp guns that would open up new markets for their advanced weapons after winning the war, which surely shouldn't take too long, but it may have been that the Austrian emperor was simply too house-poor to cover Franz Ferdinand's gambling debts, and Austria declared war on Serbia on the 28th of July, while the dominoes predictably fell all the way across Europe. Britain had thrown in because they thought that if the crown threatened to come in on Russia's side, the Austrian emperor would reconsider his stratagem, but it was not to be. And the final nail in the coffin that guaranteed Britain joining the Great War happened when the German Chancellor, who was the primary agent pushing for war with Russia, offered to make a military alliance with Turkey on the 28th, and the German Chancellor had been in charge of the planning of the Berlin to Baghdad Railroad. The German Chancellor was an expert on everything having to do with the railways in Europe, so he would have known intimately about the gambling on the trains, and his name was pronounced Betman, and he was from a major banking family, and the big banks were at the heart of the railroads. And during the July crisis, Betman Holwig was at the forefront of wanting to punish the Russians for having given Franz Ferdinand the money to gamble himself into such crushing debt. Determined to blame Russia for the outset of the war, Austria was insisting that Serbia take the blame for Franz Ferdinand's death, and the German-Turkish alliance was signed on the 30th of July, and full Russian mobilization began the next day. The Germans sent a telegram to Viviani saying that if Russia didn't stop mobilizing, Germany would attack France. And the French mobilized on the 1st of August, and that evening the Germans marched into Luxembourg after declaring war on Russia. Perhaps it cannot be known whether Franz Ferdinand's uncle knew, or he chose to believe, or perhaps didn't know, whether or not Serbia had been behind the assassination, but the Austrian emperor had signed an order of mobilization against Serbia on the 25th of July, and the Tsar had put the Russian army on alert that same day. The Tsar was a God-fearing man and didn't think it was fair to blame Serbia for the assassination of the heir to the Austrian throne, and many diplomats had demanded that Austria publish their findings from investigations into the murder of Franz Ferdinand and his wife, but the Austrians had nothing more than circumstantial evidence along with wishful thinking, and the people who knew were keeping silent and remained in history anonymous. The person who shot Franz Ferdinand was 20 years old and had come from a very poor village, and he'd gone to Belgrade to go to school, and 4 of his school friends with him, who could be blamed for the assassination, were sentenced to death by hanging, but 3 of them were under the legal age for execution, so they were sentenced to 20 years in solitary confinement. The young men were taken to Theresienstadt and kept in a basement dungeon with 22 pounds of iron shackles each, and the one who'd killed Franz Ferdinand would die of TB in April of 1918 after losing his arm to the disease, and 7 months later the Great War would be over.